Caleb Huxley had never asked for any of this. He was a tech specialist, not a hero, and certainly not someone who could stop the galaxy from spiraling into chaos. But when the attack came, and his own home planet was nearly torn apart by a cataclysmic shockwave, everything changed. The blast from the mysterious cosmic force had destroyed entire cities, leaving Earth in a state of shock. Caleb, stuck in a dusty office in the heart of New York, had barely escaped with his life. It felt like a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. He was standing on the roof of a makeshift shelter, watching the burning skyline of the city below. It was then that the message arrived, a strange transmission broadcast across all frequencies. A faint, static-filled voice crackled through the comlink, and a holographic figure appeared before him, seemingly conjured from thin air. Caleb Huxley, human. You are the last hope of this galaxy. You must come. The figure, an alien unlike any Caleb had ever seen, had golden eyes that shimmered like the stars themselves. It spoke with an air of urgency that cut through Caleb's shock and disbelief. Galactic forces are on the verge of annihilation. Only you can stop it. Your destiny is tied to the ancient powers of the lost race. You are needed. Needed for what? Caleb stammered, his voice hoarse. What do you want from me? I'm no one. Just a guy with no skills beyond fixing broken computers. But the alien's gaze was unwavering. You possess what the galaxy cannot survive without. The power of the ancients resides within you, dormant, but waking. The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving Caleb staring at the empty air in disbelief. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. The power of the ancients? What could that possibly mean? It wasn't long before the rest of the world understood. The destructive force wasn't just a one-off attack. It was the beginning of an invasion, an unstoppable force consuming the galaxy, and Earth was in its direct path. The aliens had arrived. Not the benevolent ones he had imagined, but something far worse, a malevolent entity known as the Void Storm, a cosmic horror that had destroyed every civilization in its wake, a darkness that devoured entire star systems and left nothing but ashes. Caleb didn't have the luxury of denial. The attack had already reached the outer colonies, and the ripple effects were spreading fast. The Void Storm wasn't just a force of nature, it was intelligent, calculating, and worst of all, it had discovered the human race. Minutes later, Caleb's apartment was flooded with holographic messages from a desperate coalition of species. Leaders from across the galaxy pleaded for humanity's help, though they didn't understand how much they were asking of a species that had only recently joined the galactic stage. The humans were barely prepared for the attack, and the surviving forces were fractured. And yet, they knew of Caleb. The messages insisted it was him, only him, who could wield the power to turn the tide. But Caleb felt like he was losing his mind. A guy who could barely make it through a standard workday in his tech job was suddenly supposed to save the galaxy. But then, as his mind raced through the impossible scenario, he received another call, this one from a person he knew well. Lieutenant Zoraval, a soldier he had met years ago during a brief stint with a military tech firm. She had always been a no-nonsense leader, a woman of few words and even fewer fears. When her face appeared on his screen, her expression was grim. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice calm despite the storm outside. "You're not just humanity's hope, Caleb. You're the galaxy's last chance. You're being summoned. Pack your things. I'm coming to get you." Before he could speak, the transmission cut off. Caleb stared at the empty screen, the weight of her words sinking in. The last chance, the reluctant hero, him. He gritted his teeth, a wave of determination flooding through him. He had no choice. There was no going back. The moment Caleb stepped into the sleek, metallic transport ship, the doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him away from the world he'd known. A soft hum filled the air as the ship's engines roared to life, lifting him off Earth's surface, and Caleb felt a strange sensation of weightlessness. not just physically, but mentally. The vast expanse of space stretched out in every direction, a void that seemed to echo with endless possibilities. But Caleb wasn't feeling awe or wonder. He felt a deep, gnawing dread. Lieutenant Zora Vowell stood near the front of the ship, her eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of her. Her tactical uniform was battle-worn, her face serious and unyielding. Caleb had always admired her ability to keep calm under pressure, but now he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of countless battles etched into her every movement. "You're sure about this?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His hands were clammy as he gripped the armrest of his seat. Zora glanced back at him, a flicker of something almost like sympathy crossing her features. "You don't have a choice. None of us do." She turned back to the display, showing a map of the galaxy, and the terrifying path the void storm was carving through it. The map was dotted with the coordinates of the most recent attacks. Entire systems wiped out in a matter of hours, civilizations reduced to dust. Each target was marked with a red dot, each dot a death sentence. As the ship streaked through the dark void of space, Caleb tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a fight against something ancient and unstoppable. And somehow, despite the fact that he was the galaxy's chosen one, it felt like the odds were already stacked too high. His mind kept looping back to one thought: why me? Zora's voice broke through his thoughts. "We'll meet the rest of the crew soon. They're the ones who'll help you figure out how to use the power inside you. We're all in this together." Caleb nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. The truth was, he was scared that he wouldn't be able to rise to the occasion, that the others would be counting on him, and he'd let them down. But there was no going back now. The ship's course shifted, and within moments, they arrived at their destination, a massive space station floating just outside the outskirts of a dying star system. The station Salian was a hub for many species from across the galaxy, a place where alliances were formed, strategies were devised, and resources were pooled. But Caleb quickly noticed that the station's once glittering exterior now looked weathered, as if it had been under constant siege for far too long. As they docked, Caleb felt a sense of unease settle over him. He'd never been on a space station this large, and the cold, metallic environment didn't help ease his nerves. People? No, creatures of all shapes and sizes moved through the hallways, and Caleb couldn't help but stare at the strange, multi-limbed beings, the towering alien warriors, the sleek and elegant diplomats. In a way, he felt out of place, like a child walking through an alien world. Zora led him through the labyrinthine corridors of the station to a briefing room, where Caleb was introduced to the rest of the team, a motley crew of fighters, engineers, and strategists. Each of them had their own story, their own reasons for joining the fight, and each of them looked at Caleb with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Commander Torexian, a battle-hardened veteran from a dying species, stood at the head of the room. Her armor was battered, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "I've read the reports," she said, her voice cold but respectful. "You're the one with the power we need, but don't think for a second that we're going to put all our hopes on your shoulders alone. You'll fight alongside us, or not at all." Caleb swallowed hard but nodded. It was clear that they had no intention of coddling him, no desire to treat him like some messianic figure, and in a way, that was a relief. The pressure to be their savior was already too much, but still, their eyes were on him, waiting for him to prove himself. Dax, the engineer, a wiry, nervous alien with the ability to hack any system in seconds, was already tinkering with the artifact Caleb had brought with him. He had a lot of theories about the object, but nothing concrete. The void storm had left them with few clues and even fewer answers. Caleb couldn't help but feel useless as Dax ran his fingers over the ancient relic, muttering to himself in a language Caleb couldn't understand. Ilya, a fierce alien warrior from the Outer Rim, cracked her knuckles, and grinned at Caleb. "So you're the one they say can save us all. I hope you're ready to fight." Her words were laced with humor, but Caleb saw the desperation in her eyes. No one in this room had the luxury of waiting. They were all in the thick of it. As the briefing began, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the room was sizing him up, waiting for him to either rise to the occasion or fall flat. And worse yet, he knew they were right. He wasn't ready, but he was all they had. The void storm was coming, and it wouldn't stop until everything was consumed. And Caleb? He had no choice but to figure out how to stop it or watch everything he cared about burn. The following days aboard Salian were a blur of briefings, training, and uneasy quiet. Caleb felt out of place, caught in a whirlwind of alien technology, battle plans, and cryptic hints about the dormant power inside him. Every step he took felt like he was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into the abyss of uncertainty. The crew was preparing for their first mission, a desperate attempt to reclaim an abandoned research station on the edge of a collapsing system. It was believed to house vital data on the void storm's origin and potential weaknesses. The hope was that somewhere in the wreckage, there would be answers, or at least a lead. Caleb was expected to lead a small team to the surface, but each time he thought about what that would mean. Leading them into the unknown, where every second counted, the weight felt unbearable. He spent hours with Dax, poring over the strange artifact he had brought from Earth. The object, a crystalline relic pulsing with an ethereal blue light, seemed to hum with energy. Caleb had no idea how to unlock its potential, but Dax seemed to think that it was the key to everything. "This," Dax said, running a small tool along the surface, "is older than most of the known galaxy, and it's designed to interface with human physiology in a way we've never seen before. Whoever made this, they had you in mind." Caleb's fingers hovered over the artifact, the glow intensifying as if responding to his touch. It was strange, alien, and yet familiar. He could feel something deep inside himself, something that stirred when he was close to it. "How do we use it?" Caleb asked, his voice low, the anxiety creeping in. Dax's eyes darted around, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not about using it. It's about letting it use you." He paused, staring at the crystal with an intensity that made Caleb uneasy. "This thing isn't just technology. It's a conduit, a gateway. If we're going to understand how to activate its power, we need you to make the connection. It's in your blood, Caleb. Somehow, you're the key." Caleb took a deep breath. He was no hero, no mystic. He was just a man from a broken earth, thrown into a war against an impossible enemy. And now, they were telling him that his body could somehow unlock the salvation of the galaxy. He didn't even understand how the artifact worked, let alone what kind of power it could give him. The thought was overwhelming. "You're telling me," Caleb said slowly, "that if I touch this thing, I could become something else, something like the ancients." Dax nodded. "You may already be something else, and you just don't know it yet. We've seen hints of it, Caleb. Your reactions to certain stimuli, the energy signatures around you, the way the artifact resonates with your touch, it's undeniable. Whatever this power is, it's within you, but you have to unlock it." Caleb's mind was a storm of confusion and fear. He was terrified of the unknown, of what the power might do to him or what it might ask of him. But worse than that, he was terrified of failing, of letting down the crew who had placed their hopes in him, of watching the galaxy burn while he stood by powerless. That evening, as Caleb lay in his bunk, staring out at the endless expanse of stars through the viewport, Zara came to check on him. She didn't knock. She simply entered, her presence strong and commanding, yet there was a softness in her eyes that made Caleb uneasy. "You good?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "I don't know," Caleb replied. "I feel like I'm supposed to be something I'm not. Something bigger, but I don't know how to get there." Zara stepped into the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I get it. Hell, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't feeling the same way. She walked over to the small table where the artifact lay. But what's the alternative, Caleb? Do you let the Void Storm win? Do you sit back while everything we fought for is erased from existence? Caleb looked at her, the gravity of her words sinking in. You don't understand. I'm not ready for this. I don't even know how to begin understanding this power. I don't even know what it is, let alone how to control it. Zura's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. I get it, but sometimes you don't have to be ready. Sometimes you just have to step forward. We're all counting on you, but you don't have to carry the weight alone. We're in this together, and right now, this is your moment. No one else can do what you can do. Her words hit harder than he expected. Maybe it was the reassurance, or maybe it was the quiet strength in her voice, but something clicked inside Caleb. He knew what was at stake. He knew the crew was relying on him, but more than that, the galaxy was too. The next day, the mission began. Caleb stood at the front of a small assault team, preparing to disembark onto the wreckage of the research station. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was something else stirring within him. The power of the relic, the stirring of something ancient and primal. For the first time, Caleb felt like he might just have the strength to face what was coming. The artifact was with him, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was ready to show him what he was truly capable of. The shuttle's engines hummed as it glided toward the abandoned research station, a hollow remnant of a once thriving hub, now left to rot in the shadow of a dying star. Caleb's team sat in tense silence, each member preparing for what lay ahead. The mission was simple, or at least that's what it seemed on paper. Retrieve any data on the Void Storm and get out before the station's deteriorating orbit caused it to plummet into the black hole at the center of the system. Yet, as the shuttle breached the station's atmosphere, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The absence of life was oppressive, like a wound that had never healed, a broken promise left in the wake of an unseen tragedy. The research station's exterior was battered, scared by whatever had happened in the final days of its existence. A mass of twisted metal and crumbling hull, it floated as a silent tomb in the void. Zora's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and commanding. Stay focused. We don't know what we're walking into. Keep your weapons ready and watch your backs. Caleb nodded, though his palms were slick with sweat. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare him for the reality. The station's corridors would likely be filled with debris, broken equipment, and perhaps even more dangerous remnants. Void Storm scouts, perhaps, or worse. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the artifact. The strange crystalline object that was now secured in a pack on his back. The whispers inside his mind had only grown louder since he first touched it. There was power within him, something, and it was only a matter of time before he would need to tap into it. As the shuttle docked with the station's airlock, the door opened with a soft hiss, and the team stepped out onto the metal floor. The station's interior was cold and eerily quiet. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across abandoned consoles and scattered debris. A faint hum of failing power systems was the only sound that greeted them. Stay sharp, Zara ordered, motioning for the team to split up. We'll cover more ground that way. Caleb moved cautiously, his senses heightened. Every creak of the station, every movement in the corner of his eye felt amplified, as if the place itself was watching him. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand, following the designated path toward the central command hub, where the core systems were located. The rest of the team would search the outlying sectors for any survivors or additional threats. The deeper Caleb ventured into the station, the more he felt the weight of the silence. Something wasn't right. The station had been abandoned, yet the air was thick with a presence he couldn't quite place. The metallic walls seemed to pulse with a low energy, like the remnants of something that once lived. And then he saw it. A flicker on the edge of his vision, a figure moving in the shadows. Caleb froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He wasn't alone. He raised his rifle and motioned for the others to hold their position. But when the shadow came into full view, Caleb's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a soldier or a scout. It was an alien, or at least something resembling one. It was tall and thin, its skin stretched taut over its bones, an unsettling gray hue. Its eyes were large and black, and it seemed to hover, its body barely touching the ground. It was unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. "Zara, I've got something," Caleb whispered into his comms, but the transmission was swallowed by static. The strange being remained silent, its gaze locked on Caleb. He could feel its presence pressing against his mind, like an invisible weight. The air grew cold, and his breath came in shallow gasps. This was no ordinary alien. This thing was other, something beyond comprehension. The creature took a step forward, and Caleb instinctively raised his rifle, though he knew it was useless against whatever this being was. The entity's form rippled, its shape flickering like a glitch in reality. In that moment, Caleb understood. This wasn't an alien at all. It was a manifestation, a fragment of the Void Storm, an avatar of the destructive force that had been devouring the galaxy. Before Caleb could react, the being lunged forward, faster than he could track. It struck like a shadow, its long fingers gripping his throat, its presence like a storm cloud over his consciousness. Caleb gasped for air, his vision darkening, but then, as if from a distant place, he felt it. The power, the dormant energy inside him, surged to life. The artifact, it hummed with a deep resonance, calling to him. With every ounce of strength he had left, Caleb reached for it, tearing it from his pack and gripping it in both hands. The instant his fingers touched the crystal, a pulse of light erupted from it, engulfing his entire body. He felt the energy course through him, his body filling with something foreign, ancient, but incredibly alive. The creature screeched, its grip loosening, and for a moment, Caleb saw it for what it truly was, a fragile illusion. With a sudden burst of power, Caleb thrust the artifact forward, and a shockwave of energy erupted from him, slamming into the entity. The being screamed in agony, its form warping and disintegrating into nothingness, dissolving into a cloud of dust and whispers. For a long moment, Caleb stood there, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. The artifact had done something. It had responded to him, to the threat. He had felt the power in his hands, and for the first time, it felt like he wasn't just an ordinary man. He was something more. But as the station fell silent once more, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever this force was, it had taken notice of him, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. The fight for the galaxy had just begun. The aftermath of the encounter left Caleb shaken but alive. The strange entity had dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint smell of burnt ozone and the eerie hum of the station's failing systems. He could still feel the energy from the artifact swirling within him, a reminder that whatever he had become in that moment was not entirely under his control. His heart was still pounding in his chest, adrenaline rushing through his veins as he staggered backward, trying to regain his composure. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and for a moment, he feared that whatever other horrors the station held would soon come to claim him. "Caleb, report." Zora's voice crackled through the comms, her tone urgent. Caleb snapped out of his daze and fumbled for his communicator. "It's gone," he rasped, still trying to catch his breath. But it wasn't alone. There's something else here, something worse. He could hear Zora's sharp intake of breath. "Stay put. We're on our way. Don't engage anything else until we get there." Caleb looked around, his mind racing. He could still sense the presence of the Void Storm entity, the faint traces of its energy lingering in the station's air like a ghost. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was an insidious, intangible force that seemed to worm its way into the very fabric of reality. He began moving cautiously through the corridors, eyes scanning every corner. The energy from the artifact was pulsing within him, urging him to keep moving forward, as though it knew something he didn't. But Caleb wasn't sure he could trust it. He wasn't sure he could trust himself. When he reached the central hub, the command room of the research station, he was met with the cold, mechanical silence of a place long abandoned. Consoles were flickering in and out of life, their screens displaying lines of corrupted data and static. The core systems were still functional enough to display some of the station's final logs, but much of it had been corrupted in the chaos before its abandonment. "Caleb, we're almost there," Zara's voice came through again, but this time it was tinged with an urgency that sent a chill down his spine. "Stay close to the entrance. We don't know what we're walking into." Just as Caleb turned to move toward the airlock, a low, guttural noise echoed through the station. It was distant, but unmistakable. It sounded like whispering. The kind of whisper you hear in the back of your mind when something is trying to crawl into your thoughts, trying to make you hear things that aren't really there. His pulse quickened. The station was alive with something. "Zara, something's here," Caleb muttered, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallways. The whispering was growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the air grew thick, the temperature plummeting, and Caleb felt his breath catch in his throat. The walls seemed to warp, twisting around him, as though reality itself was being bent and reshaped. It was the artifact. It was reacting again. "Caleb?" Zora's voice crackled through the static, but it sounded distant, muffled. Her words were being consumed by the unnatural presence. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form flickering in and out of focus. It was not like the entity he had fought earlier, but something far more terrifying. This one didn't move. It simply stood, its glowing eyes fixed on him, its body almost translucent, its outline distorted like a mirage. "Help us," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices layered on top of one another. "You are the only one who can stop it. You are the key." The words sent a wave of nausea through Caleb, his stomach lurching as the energy in his body flared again. The artifact thrummed, and a flash of light erupted from it, filling the room with an unbearable brightness. For a split second, everything stopped. The whispering, the shifting reality, the figure, they were gone. Caleb blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the disorientation. The room had returned to normal, or at least as normal as it had been before. But the presence of the artifact lingered in his mind, its hum now a constant pulse in the back of his thoughts. The whispering was still there, but it was quieter now, distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spoken to him was still watching, waiting for him to make a choice. A heavy hand fell on his shoulder, and he whipped around, his rifle raised instinctively. But it was Zara. "We felt that," she said softly, her voice strained. "What did you see?" Caleb hesitated, unsure of how to describe the experience. He couldn't put it into words, couldn't explain what had just happened. "I don't know," he muttered. "It was like a vision. The station, it's not just abandoned. It's haunted by something. It's not just the void storm." Zura's eyes narrowed. "Whatever it is, it's tied to the artifact, isn't it?" Caleb nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her question settle on his chest. "Yes, and I think it's been waiting for me, waiting for us." The air in the station grew colder again, and Caleb's stomach twisted. The void storm wasn't just a galactic force of destruction. It was something older, something that had been waiting for the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. The galaxy was dying, and Caleb was the only one who could stop it. But the price of failure was higher than he could have ever imagined. The whispers had only just begun. The station's airlock hissed as the door slowly closed behind them, sealing off whatever had been lurking in the station's depths. Caleb felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders, the strange, pulsing energy from the artifact still thrumming within him. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices trying to claw their way into his mind. It wasn't just the artifact calling out anymore. It was something else, something older. Zora's voice cut through the tension as she checked the mission's status. We're running out of time. The station's orbit is decaying faster than anticipated. If we're going to retrieve anything useful, we need to get to the central archive now. Caleb nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact, whatever it truly was waiting for him to make the next move. His every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the station behind, but the urgency of their mission gnawed at him. They couldn't afford to leave empty-handed, not with the entire galaxy on the verge of collapse. "Let's go," Caleb said, though his voice felt distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. They moved swiftly through the station's corridors, the low hum of the failing power systems echoing in their ears. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, the walls seeming to close in around them. Caleb's thoughts kept drifting back to the vision he had experienced earlier, the translucent figure, the whispering voices, the feeling of something ancient and malicious pressing against his mind. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a vessel, something greater than human, but at what cost? The central archive was located in the heart of the station, a large chamber filled with banks of flickering terminals and dusty data pads. Caleb's heart sank as they entered. It wasn't just the failing technology or the scattered debris that unnerved him. It was the unmistakable sense of dread that hung in the air like a fog. Something had been here, and it wasn't just the void storm. "We're not alone," Zora said quietly, her hand resting on the hilt of her sidearm. She had already noticed the strange energy readings on the nearby console, the fluctuations that hinted at something being active in the room. "I felt it too," Caleb replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. The presence was undeniable, like a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, something waiting for the right moment to strike. He moved toward the central terminal, where the last of the station's encrypted data was stored. As he powered up the system, the flickering screen displayed a warning in red letters. "Data corruption detected." "Great," Caleb muttered, tapping the screen in frustration. "We're not getting any useful data off this. Whatever happened here, it fried everything." Zora approached the terminal, her face grim. "Maybe not everything. Check the secondary archives. They're isolated from the core systems. If we can access them, we might still have a chance to find something useful." As Caleb moved toward the secondary terminal, a soft, familiar hum vibrated through the air. The artifact. It was reacting again, more strongly this time. His hands shook as he reached for it, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface of the crystal, the whispers in his mind grew deafening. "Caleb, what's happening?" Zara asked, her voice tight with concern. Before he could answer, a pulse of energy exploded from the artifact, sending a shockwave through the room. The lights flickered violently, the terminals sparking and sputtering as a violent surge of power tore through the station's remaining systems. The whispers intensified, turning into a maddening cacophony of voices. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward, the same translucent entity Caleb had seen earlier, its form still flickering in and out of focus. But this time, it was different. It was larger, its shape more solid, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. "I see you, human," the entity said, its voice a distorted blend of 1,000 voices. "You have awakened me." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a projection. The void storm itself had manifested in this place, and it was aware of him. "You were never meant to find this," the figure continued, its voice like 1,000 knives scraping against his skull. "You were never meant to unlock the power of the artifact. But now that you have..." The figure reached toward Caleb, and for a moment, he could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on him, its energy twisting around him like a vice. But Caleb didn't flinch. The artifact in his hand burned brighter, its energy flaring once more. The power coursing through him surged again, more intense this time. He had no idea how, but he knew. He knew that he had to stop this. He couldn't let the void storm consume everything. "Leave, now," Caleb growled, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made his skin crawl. "You are not ready for what comes next. You will never be ready." With a final flicker of light, the entity lunged toward him, but before it could make contact, Caleb raised the artifact in front of him, unleashing a blast of raw energy. The room erupted in a blaze of light as the entity's form writhed and screamed. The power was beyond anything he had ever felt, a force that could bend reality itself. For a moment, everything went still. The entity's form began to disintegrate, its features unraveling into streams of light and shadow, vanishing into the air as if it had never been there at all. But Caleb wasn't sure whether he had won. The artifact still hummed within his hands, a constant reminder that whatever this power was, it was far from over. As the last of the shadows faded, Zara stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" I don't know," Caleb said, his voice distant. "But we have to leave. Now." The station systems were failing faster now, and the time to escape was running out. But Caleb had a sinking feeling that the battle they had just fought was nothing compared to what was coming. The void storm had taken notice of him, and it was far from finished. The station's power systems flickered again, the hum of dying machinery reverberating through the walls. Caleb could still feel the artifact's pulse in his hands, faint but constant, as though it were alive and waiting for something more. The moment the entity had disintegrated, he'd thought he had defeated it. But the feeling deep in his gut told him that it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The artifact, this strange relic that had inexplicably fused with his very being, was far more than a mere tool. It was a key, unlocking doors to things that should not have been touched. "Caleb." Zora's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "The station's crumbling. We need to move now." He glanced over his shoulder at her, his pulse quickening. She was right. The walls were shaking, debris falling from the ceiling in a slow, agonizing cascade. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning circuits. The void storm entity might have been gone for now, but something much darker was about to take its place. The fabric of reality itself felt as if it was tearing apart. "We need to get to the escape pod," Caleb muttered, already heading toward the corridor. But the path to the pod was long, winding through the collapsing structure, and every step forward seemed to take them deeper into the chaos. "We don't have much time," Zara urged, grabbing his arm to stop him. "If the station is on the verge of full collapse, it's going to take everything with it. We need to make it out before." A loud, deafening crack echoed through the station, followed by an explosion of lights and sparks as a massive section of the wall ruptured. The shockwave threw them both off their feet, and Caleb hit the ground hard, the artifact in his hand flaring in response to the violent surge of energy. "Caleb," Zora shouted, scrambling to her feet. "We can't keep running blindly. What's going on with that thing?" She pointed to the artifact in his hand, which was now glowing with an intensity that sent ripples of fear down his spine. The whispers were louder than ever, a clamor of voices almost too much to bear. The energy coursing through him was becoming a storm, a force that threatened to consume him whole. "I don't know," Caleb said, struggling to his feet. "I think it's connected to everything here. The void storm was just one part of this. Whatever it is, it's tied to the galaxy's collapse. I can feel it. It's spreading." "Spreading?" Zora's face hardened. "Is that what this is about? The galaxy's been dying, and now it's linked to you." Caleb didn't have time to answer. The air around them began to shimmer and warp, as if reality itself were bending. The walls groaned with a tortured creaking, and the floor buckled beneath them. A low, rumbling sound echoed from the station's core, the sound of something massive and insidious stirring from its slumber. Zora pulled him toward the exit. Caleb, now, it's not just the station collapsing. Something else is coming. He didn't need to be told twice. They ran, their boots pounding on the shifting metal floor as they made their way toward the escape pod bay. But the station was no longer the silent, lifeless place it had been before. It was alive with energy, with something that felt like it was clawing its way through from another dimension. The further they went, the more distorted the space became. The walls shimmered, the air thickened with a sense of dread. "We're too late," Caleb muttered as they reached the escape pod bay. His heart sank as he saw the pod's bay doors wide open, the pods themselves gone. Zora's face paled. What happened? They should have been here. Caleb scanned the room, his mind racing. It's not the station anymore. The energy, it's warping everything. The artifact's power has triggered a shift. Suddenly, the entire bay began to distort before their eyes. The space itself seemed to melt, twisting in on itself. Figures, distorted and half-formed, flickered in and out of existence, like ghosts trapped between worlds. A shadow rose from the center of the room, taking shape as it solidified into a massive, looming figure. "Did you really think you could escape?" The voice was cold, almost familiar, the same distorted chorus of voices that Caleb had heard before, now echoing through the fabric of space itself. Zora drew her sidearm, but Caleb could already feel it. The figure was not something they could fight. It was beyond their reach. The entity's eyes, burning with unnatural light, locked onto Caleb. "You are the Harbinger," it said, its voice resonating deep within Caleb's chest, rattling his very bones. "The galaxy's death is your birthright." "No," Caleb managed to force out, the weight of the words threatening to crush him. "I won't let you." The figure laughed, a terrible, hollow sound. "You have no choice, human. You are already ours." The energy from the artifact flared again, an explosion of light so intense that Caleb could barely keep his eyes open. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it reached toward him, its massive, ghostly hand extending through the air with inhuman speed. Caleb knew what he had to do. There was no time left. He could either run or make a stand. The artifact in his hands pulsed, and Caleb gritted his teeth, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "I won't be your pawn," he spat, raising the artifact. "The galaxy's fate is not yours to control." The shadowed figure lunged, and Caleb made his choice. The shadowed figure's hand reached toward Caleb with a speed that defied reality, its form an unholy distortion of light and darkness. As it closed in, Caleb felt the weight of everything bearing down on him. The crumbling station, the dying galaxy, the ancient power of the artifact that still thrummed through his veins. But something else surged within him, something he hadn't felt before, the unmistakable resolve to fight, to not let this be the end. He gripped the artifact tightly, the energy pulsing in sync with his heartbeat, as if it were alive, as if it were finally answering his call. The whispers in his mind became a roar, a cacophony of voices urging him forward. The power wasn't just in his hands. It was within him, part of him. "Die," Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. With a snap of his wrist, he thrust the artifact forward, unleashing a wave of raw, unfiltered energy. The shockwave was blinding. It ripped through the space, tearing apart the very fabric of the distorted reality around them. The shadowed figure screeched, its form writhing in agony as the wave of energy slammed into it. The sound was deafening, like the tearing of the universe itself. The air burned, the station around them quaking as if it, too, were caught in the grip of something ancient and powerful. The figure's form flickered, crackling under the force of Caleb's assault. It was real, it was tangible, but it was also part of something greater, something that Caleb had barely begun to understand. Yet in that moment, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If this was a fight between him and the dying galaxy, he would not let it be the galaxy that fell. The ground trembled, and the station's walls began to warp, the energy flooding through the corridors, spiraling out of control. But Caleb didn't stop. His hands shook as the artifact grew hotter, more volatile, its energy swelling to an unfathomable intensity. "You cannot stop this," the figure rasped, its voice thick with distortion. "The galaxy will die. The void is inevitable. You are nothing." "I am human," Caleb spat, his voice steady despite the overwhelming power coursing through him. "And I refuse to let this happen." With a primal scream, Caleb thrust the artifact forward once more. The energy roared to life, a blinding column of light and force that engulfed everything in its path. The shadowed figure howled in torment as the energy wrapped around it, twisting and contorting it into a mass of light and shadow, unraveling it from the inside out. And then, silence. The station's tremors subsided, and the walls stopped shaking. The air, once thick with the scent of burning circuitry and decay, seemed to clear, though the oppressive weight still lingered, heavy in the silence. Caleb stood, breathing heavily, the artifact still humming in his hand, though now its glow had dimmed to a soft pulse. His heart raced in his chest, his body trembling from the strain. He had no idea if the galaxy was truly saved, if the void storm was gone for good, but the immediate danger was over. Zora appeared at his side, her eyes wide with shock and relief. Did you do it?" Caleb's eyes flickered to the now deserted space, where the figure had once stood. He could still feel the energy, faint but undeniable, still lingering in the air. "I think so, but it's not over, Zara. The artifact, it's more than we thought. It's part of something much bigger." Zora frowned, glancing around them. "The galaxy, it's still dying. The void storm may be gone, but—" "No," Caleb interrupted, his voice firm. "The storm was only the beginning. The galaxy's decay is still happening, but we've bought it time. We've done something." Zura looked at him, her expression softening. "Then what now?" Caleb looked at the artifact in his hands, the once ominous glow now strangely comforting. "Now, we figure out what this thing really is, and we make sure it never happens again." He turned away from the wreckage, the fading hum of the station the only sound in the silence that followed. Though the battle was won, the war was far from over. The galaxy had suffered, and there was no telling what horrors lay hidden in the depths of the stars. But Caleb was no longer a reluctant savior. He had embraced his role, and whatever it took, he would ensure that humanity stood as the last line of defense. The artifact's pulse slowed, but Caleb could feel it in his bones. The fight was far from over, and he was ready.